Hey guys, Level Cap here. Today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest missed opportunities in the first-person shooter genre. You ever find yourself playing a game and think, you know what, this game's almost perfect, but it's really just missing a key multiplayer component, or the single player could have been that much better, or why didn't they just add a game mode like this? Well, today we're going to be focusing on the biggest missed opportunities of first-person shooters over the recent years. Let's start off talking about the Battlefield franchise. Now, Battlefield has been on the rise. Bad Company 2 to Battlefield 3 to BF4 and now Battlefield 1. Each title has outsold the previous, gaining more and more popularity. But despite the improved sales figures, there's one aspect of the genre that EA just can't quite figure out what to do with, and that's the eSports scene. Battlefield 3 had a huge $1.6 million tournament announcement at the launch of the game, and then that tournament just never happened. EA's inability to organize an esports scene around the Battlefield community has been somewhat comical, especially considering that the community itself has organized their own esports events without the help of EA. In fact, I used to compete back in Battlefield 2 and Battlefield 2142. There was an esports scene for the game all the way back then, and EA has completely failed to capitalize on it, but they haven't failed to show us that they actually want to do something with esports. They just, unfortunately, can't figure out what to do with it. The current game itself has been balanced around a very large format, somewhat casual shooter nature, which doesn't exactly translate into a competitive FPS particularly well. And with Battlefield 1, EA's failure to implement custom servers that can be privated has basically killed any chance of a competitive scene. Players literally cannot set up private matches to play against each other. Despite this, EA seems to be developing an esports division somewhere around the Battlefield franchise, just nobody can quite figure out what they're trying to do. At this point, I don't have a lot of faith in EA's ability to turn Battlefield into an esports relevant game, despite the fact that the community has wanted it for years. I think it's taken so long to get the ball rolling with EA that by the time they actually come out with any decent effort, the market will already be saturated with games like Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege, Counter-Strike, and maybe some of the new Battle Royale games. Now, speaking of Battle Royale and missed opportunities, I can't not mention Ghost Recon Wildlands. The game is marketed and sold as primarily a single-player game. In fact, the PvP multiplayer hasn't been implemented yet. And when you check out the forums or read up on what people were hoping the PvP would be for Ghost Recon Wildlands, everybody was expecting some sort of Battle Royale game mode. They developed this huge open world engine with all the assets you would need for a Battle Royale game, with vehicles, hundreds of weapons, parachuting, all kinds of different elements that can get you around, and would have been perfectly conducive to a giant open format Battle Royale. Sadly, when Ubisoft started talking about the PvP multiplayer, they mentioned doing a 4 versus 4 tactical squad-based format. Now, this is kind of more traditional, and it seems to completely ignore some of the biggest advantages that Ghost Recon Wildlands has, which again is the huge open world, a great vehicle and physics systems, and hundreds of guns. Imagine an H1Z1 or PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds in the Ghost Recon Wildlands game engine. Sounds like a dream come true, right? How did Ubisoft miss this one? I have very little excitement regarding the 4 versus 4 PvP mode that they're working on, and if I were Ubisoft, I would pivot and try and design a Battle Royale game mode around what you already have. So much work has already been done to Ghost Recon Wildlands, I feel like creating a Battle Royale game mode probably wouldn't take all that long, and by the time it came out, it could completely revitalize interest in this game and turn it into something people were not even expecting at all. Now, sometimes the biggest missed opportunities aren't game design opportunities, but rather just neglecting an entire gaming market. I feel like there have been few bigger mistakes when it comes to this kind of neglect than not releasing Destiny for the PC market. So many PC players wanted to play Destiny 1. There's a huge MMO crowd on PC, in case Bungie was unaware. In fact, that's pretty much where MMOs originated, and it's where most of the player base exists, plus the FPS crowd on PC is huge. So it seems like a perfect marriage of the FPS lovers and MMO lovers, why was that title not released on PC? Now, of course, we are getting Destiny 2 on PC, but it's hard to say what the aftermath is going to be of the first title not coming out on PC. There's going to be a huge PC gaming market that might not feel inclined to buy the game simply because they never played the original. Maybe you'll feel like you're behind the storyline, you won't really understand what's going on, or you've just been involved in other games. You missed the hype train that was created around the initial release. I mean, there was so much hype created for Destiny 1. Without question, that hype bubble has popped, or at least shrunk a significant margin, so the PC crowd just might not be as willing to adopt the title this time around. Only time will tell, but I think, again, not releasing Destiny 1 on PC was not only a huge mistake for the original game, but it could have severe impacts on the PC sales for the sequel. Now, speaking of a shrinking hype bubble or missing an opportunity, I can't not mention the Crysis franchise. Crysis 1 was one of my favorite first-person shooter single-player campaigns. Sure, the story was kind of out there and a bit hokey, but the level design, the AI, everything about the gameplay was absolutely phenomenal. I think I played through Crysis 1 single player at least 4 or 5 different times, and of course messed around in the level editor quite a bit as well. Sadly, the multiplayer was pretty much garbage, and people didn't think of the Crysis games as first-person shooters that had good single-player and multiplayer, but were more of just a fun single-player romp. By the time they got around to Crysis 3, nobody was really paying that much attention to the multiplayer aspect of the game, and sadly, Crysis 3 had, in my opinion, one of the weaker single-player campaigns, but one of the best multiplayer experiences of that entire year. Unfortunately, the game didn't sell particularly well because of that diminishing hype bubble, and therefore not too many people got into the Crysis 3 multiplayer. I think if any game was ever going to bring back or get close to bringing back the arena shooter experience, it would have been the Crysis 3 multiplayer, merging traditional shooter mechanics with fast-moving super suit abilities that allowed you to jump around maps, turn invisible, and run incredibly fast. So the unfortunate irony here is that people really loved the Crysis game, at least the original Crysis game, for an excellent single-player experience. And Crysis 3 had one of the weakest single-player experiences out of the 3 titles. It lost all the magic of the original single-player, yet the multiplayer was phenomenal. But unfortunately, by this time, the hype bubble for the Crysis franchise had sunk low enough. It only took a few crummy launches to really push the game down this far, and there wasn't enough sales of Crysis 3 to not only populate the multiplayer for long enough, but even continue on the Crysis franchise. So this is one of those just kind of unfortunate diamonds that I think just went under the radar and really could have been the resurgence of the arena first-person shooter. But who knows, maybe one day somebody will make sort of a revive of this style of multiplayer. There's certainly a big attempt right now in the marketplace to try and revive the fast-paced arena shooter games. We'll have to see if it takes off, and maybe they should take some cues from Crysis 3 multiplayer. Now, while we're on the subject of sequels that essentially killed a franchise, we may as well talk about Medal of Honor Warfighter. This is a game that really hits the top of my list when I think about a game that could have been so much more had it just had a little bit more time and a little bit more talent on the dev team. And in fact, developers have come out and said that they just didn't have the talent pool they needed to execute this game properly. Plagued with bugs at launch and poor map design and frankly an unfinished looking game in which the UI and certain elements were so confusing that it became a process to try and matchmake with friends. The launch of the game was so problematic that it pretty much killed the sales and potentially killed the Medal of Honor franchise. Who knows, EA may revisit Medal of Honor at some point in the near future, but this is a game that I keep thinking about because there were certain elements of it that were really cool. It was clear they did their weapon research, as the weapon configuration was highly realistic, where you could put kits on your assault rifles that all represented specific loadouts you might take into realistic combat. The optic rendering was some of the best and most realistic I've seen in any game. I like the idea that they had so many different variants of the AR-15, but they felt like different weapons because you sort of had variations that different companies make for specific outfits. And like These are things that were all very much tied into real life weaponry and represented in the game in a really cool way. I liked a lot about it. The tactical gameplay had a lot of promise. It just wasn't a finished game, and unfortunately that really did kill the franchise. And there's been so many Medal of Honor games at this point. I hope EA does bring it back at some point. Maybe they're just waiting till the time is right. But had they given it the amount of dev time and the amount of dev skill that it needed to achieve its goals, I think they could have easily had another AAA shooter franchise success on their hands. But unfortunately, we've just got to chalk it up to another big missed opportunity. Now, the last game I want to talk about today missed its opportunity, not so much with a technical problem, but a release time. Titanfall 2 came out right between the two biggest AAA shooter franchises that we have. Battlefield 1 and the most recent Call of Duty game both came out during holiday season, and Titanfall 2 was sandwiched in between the two. It did much worse in sales than the original title, even though the game had raving reviews on Metacritic scores, and it had much more content than the original game with a solid single-player experience. The game fixed everything wrong with the original and added far more content. Now, there is some debate that the game design itself could have led to less people adopting the franchise. Titanfall 2 is a very high skill curve game. It requires a lot of dedication to be good at it, and it requires some very good twitch reflexes. You could compare it to games like Tribes, where there's a very, very high skill curve, and thus it doesn't appeal to quite as big of a player base. And I think that could have had some contributing factors to the slow adoption, or rather the lack of adoption, of Titanfall 2, as allegedly it did sell at least 4 million copies according to some reports, and if it did sell that many copies, the player base is extremely low by comparison. So one could make the argument that the game itself really didn't have enough staying power for the average gamer and was really more of a niche appeal. But regardless, there's no debate as to whether or not the launch timing hurt the sales figures of that game, and whether or not the game would have been a huge success were it a summer release. Anyway, that kind of wraps it up for this video on some of the biggest missed opportunities in first-person shooters of recent years. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you think I missed some games that had bigger missed opportunities. And as always, I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.